Hello, Shay from the Oz Arab Media team. Today, we're joined by Julian Hill, Assistant Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Thank you, Julian, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm pretty excited. It's my first time on your show.
Thank you very much for joining. Can you share with us a little bit about earlier today, the announcement for the Islamic Museum of Australia?
Yeah, I was at the Islamic Museum in Melbourne this morning for this announcement with Tony Burke, the Minister for Home Affairs and Multicultural Affairs, my boss. And it's absolutely terrific. The Commonwealth Government is investing $4 million to support the museum now in its 11th year in the next phase of its development. This will allow it to tell even more stories of Australian Muslims, in effect. The museum is dedicated to building understanding, and it's a point of pride that they were saying this morning. The majority of visitors to the museum are not Muslim Australians. There are other people wanting to learn more or understand, get a better appreciation of the rich and diverse history of Muslims in Australia, which of course goes back centuries, even before European settlement, the interaction between our Indigenous Australians and Muslims, particularly to the north of Australia. So really terrific announcement that will enable the upgrade and the modernisation of 4 galleries, but importantly, the digitisation of much of the museum's content, so it will be available to school groups and others right across Australia, even when they can't visit the museum physically in Melbourne.
Thank you for sharing. The role of museums, their significance play a very important part, especially in the changing fabric of multicultural Australia. And we're very privileged here at Oz Arab Media to have you here sharing this wonderful announcement. Can you explain to us, you touched on this a little bit before, the significance, the museum's significance?
Yeah, look, the Labor government has made this investment recognising that the museum is a critical space or a place where people can understand and learn a little more about Islam. It's not about preaching religion. It's about trying to demystify, given some of the rubbish that might be spread on the internet or in parts of the media, so that people can learn a little more, but learn those stories of Australian Muslims. It's also important and fantastic for young Australian Muslims, for kids to see role models and be inspired and see that Muslim Australians have contributed and are contributing to every part of our national life. There's also, of course, the issue of social cohesion. And, I'm really proud of Australia. Of course, like every country, there's parts of us that are imperfect, but we are the greatest multicultural country on earth. And social cohesion is not an end state, it's a process. It works when we work at it. It's how we relate to each other. And by building understanding and giving people a space like the Islamic Museum of Australia to learn a little more about their fellow Australians, we help build mutual respect and improve our social cohesion.
Thank you for sharing that with us. If we can have a look a little bit about, within the portfolio, how does this announcement contribute to the government's growing multicultural portfolio?
Well, it's one of many investments that the government is making, the Labor government is making. And success as a multicultural country, being a successful multicultural country like Australia, is not the same thing as just being diverse. Your listeners, all of us, could think of countries on earth which might have diverse populations, but which are not successful. Success requires 3 things, in my view. Firstly, deliberate government policy. And next year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam Labor government's introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act and the final abolition of the last vestiges of the old racist white Australia policy. That's a good thing. Success, though, also takes deliberate investments in community infrastructure, in supporting people to settle into life in Australia, and to tell those stories, to pass on cherished cultural traditions to the next generation and share them with their fellow Australians. And that's what this investment's about. The third ingredient, of course, in success is leadership, political leadership, faith leaders, and day in, day out community leaders who volunteer and give their time to provide those spaces and places for Australians to celebrate and share their cultures.
Will this announcement form part of any other election commitments?
Well, actually, I'm pleased to say it's not an election commitment. It's a commitment, a decision, a funding decision that the Australian government has taken. It's already budgeted, and we can now finalise agreements with the museum. So it's not an election commitment. It's not a bribe. It's not a promise. It's a funding decision that we're proud to have made.
Regardless of the outcome of the next election, this funding announcement will go ahead. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Thank you. So have there been any further details about the types of collections that may be commissioned or that may receive further investment as part of this announcement?
Well, I toured the museum again this morning, and the funding will enable the improvements, the modernisation of some of the galleries that are there, particularly to add in, as I said, those digital elements. So stories of the history of Islam to knowledge and civilization over centuries, stories of Australian Muslims, and allow those stories to be told and made available to a wider audience.
Thank you for sharing that. And I could talk a little bit more, but I think you've covered it for me in terms of the government's position on the types of collections that will go ahead. And you definitely did touch on that in your previous responses. But if we can not ignore, unfortunately, the negative aspects or consequences of multiculturalism, some would say. Earlier today, again, another hate crime against the Jewish community. How will this announcement help support greater cohesion, particularly across Muslim Australian community groups and the Jewish community groups in parts of Melbourne, but also in Sydney as well?
The incident that you're referring to of another horrible outbreak of graffiti and what is clearly an anti-Semitic act is to be condemned. That's not who we are as Australians. And if you look at the research from the Scanlon Foundation's most recent report, our social cohesion is under strain. It's held up well overall, but there are some signs that we need to take seriously. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Islamophobia is on the rise. Attitudes towards people of faith have worsened, and that's what the data shows us. I'm absolutely confident, though, in saying that the vast majority of Australians do not want foreign conflicts to divide our multicultural society. Of course, people have different views, but we're a globally connected society. What happens overseas in the world does impact daily life here, and many Australians have been traumatised by the truly horrific conflict between Israel and Hamas over the last 15 months. As we're talking in the last hour, I saw that the Israeli government has confirmed its agreement to the ceasefire deal which was struck with Hamas, and that's a sombre moment. It's a moment that I know on behalf of the Australian government, but all of the constituents that I represent from many different countries on earth, many of whom have fled conflicts in their home countries, we hope, desperately hope, that this ceasefire deal sticks, that it becomes the springboard to a rebuilding and a movement towards peace and a dignified settlement for the Palestinian people and a secure state of Israel living alongside a secure state of Palestine. That's been what the government's efforts have been directed towards. But it's also a moment to grieve for the tens of thousands of innocent lives that have been lost through this conflict, be they Israelis, be they Palestinians, be they Lebanese, or be they citizens of other countries who've been caught up in the conflict, and also the humanitarian aid workers who were literally risking, and some of whom gave their life in the cause of trying to help other vulnerable human beings. So let's hope that the ceasefire sticks. And investments like this in Australia are about our social cohesion, but they're also just about celebrating, to go back to that theme that I started with. This is not primarily an investment about foreign conflicts or social cohesion. It's an investment in a critical and beautiful cultural institution in Melbourne, the Islamic Museum of Australia, that allows the stories of now around 1 million Australian Muslims to be told and celebrated and shared. We make similar investments for other communities, be it the Vietnamese community, which this year celebrates the 50th anniversary of the onset of mass Vietnamese migration to Australia, fleeing the Vietnam War. So these are investments we make first and foremost in support of Australian communities and Australians to tell those stories and cherish their traditions and share them with others.
Thank you for sharing that. The announcement of a potential ceasefire agreement is obviously a relief for many people in Australia, especially with those that have families overseas. What would be your advice to people in Australia that want to bring that conflict or import that conflict to Australia and negate the work and the positive aspects of multicultural, the multicultural society in Australia?
Anyone who wants to bring a foreign conflict to Australia, to divide Australian society, to divide families, to divide workplaces, should not do so. You know, I feel very confident in saying the vast majority of Australians don't want to see those conflicts replicated here, whatever their views may be. And look, I'll be frank, it's been a difficult time to govern. The Australian government, at times cops criticism from people with very strongly divergent views, who want just to do one thing or do another thing. But at every point, we've tried to exercise the very limited influence that Australia has in that part of the world in the interests of peace, in the interests of humanity, in the interests of trying to advance a durable solution to this decades-old conflict, which, as Australia's policy for over 70 years has been, as two secure states living side by side. It's also been a difficult time, made more difficult because of so-called political leaders, being Peter Dutton and the Greens political party, who shamefully have chosen to try and weaponise this conflict and seek votes in certain parts of the Australian community, at times by spreading lies and disinformation, because they thought it might politically advantage them. And, the Australian government, we've called that out. We've tried consistently to respect the advice of faith leaders, of security agencies, to lower the tone and reflect on the language that we use with each other as Australians. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, and like I think everyone tuned into this conflict, we'll take, time as we do to reflect and grieve for those lost. Many Australians have lost family, they've lost loved ones, and sometimes in horrifically large numbers. But we've got to move together, move forward together as Australians.
Thank you for sharing that, Julian. And here at Oz Arab Media, we welcome the views of other elected representatives that may want to join in the conversation about this announcement, but also about the conflict and the potential ceasefire agreement between Israel and obviously Gaza. So thank you for sharing and joining us today. For those that are interested, please reach out to Julian on a personal level, online, via social. Julian, I'm going to hand over to you if you can just share with our viewers how they can best get in contact with you.
So I'm always happy to take feedback. As I say, all feedback's a gift, and I do respond to people who live in my electorate personally, but read everything else. So, like most MPs, I believe you've got to meet people where they are, whether that's down the shops, at their workplaces, in the schools, at the railway stations, or these days online. So comments on Facebook page, messages, but particularly emails from people who live in my electorate as a local MP. I'm always happy to hear from people.
Thank you so much, Julian, for joining us today on Oz Arab Media. I'm going to give you back some time in your busy schedule. And again, thank you to all of those watching online. Until next time, take care.
Thank you.